The wind had been cutting through the pines all afternoon when I heard it, a low, uneven crunch that didn't belong to deer or elk. I stepped off my porch and peered toward the ridge snowlight, making the world white and still. Then I saw her, a woman swaying under the weight of a bundled child, her boots dragging dress stiff with frost. She stumbled once, caught herself, and kept on until her knees sank deep into the drift. For a long moment I didn't move. Just watched the way she curled around that bundle like it was the only thing left in the world. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Leona Gray, and I was born in a clapboard house on the edge of Boone County, Missouri, where winter crept in under the door frames and every hand in the family worked from dawn to dusk. My father was a freighter on the river roads, gone for weeks at a time, and my mother kept us fed on cornbread beans and whatever she could coax from the garden. We weren't rich, but the Sabbath meant a full table and neighbors at the door, and you learned quick that you didn't turn anyone away in a storm. Those were the rules I was raised on. Kindness first, debts honored, and a word given was a word kept. As I grew, I found work as a midwife's helper, then took on the calling myself. It was a poor woman's trade, long hours for little pay, but it taught me what grit looked like in the eyes of someone fighting to bring a child into the world. I learned to boil water over a shaky fire to keep my hands steady, no matter how cold the night got. Those years shaped me into someone who could stand in the thick of trouble and keep her voice calm. But the world beyond our county wasn't always built on the same values. The towns along the new railroad line swelled with traders, speculators, and men who measured a day's worth by the dollars in their pockets. I saw more than one family lose their land to a clerk's ledger or a banker's stamp, and more than one woman left alone when her husband went chasing silver in the hills. It was a place where talk was cheap, promises shorter, and a person's worth could be weighed and dismissed by strangers who didn't know your name. That's where my own path took a turn. I left Boone County with a baby on the way, bound for a mountain town where I thought I could earn an honest living. But the truth is, I wasn't just chasing work, I was putting miles between myself and a man whose temper could turn a warm room cold in an instant. I told myself I'd find safety under new skies, that distance alone could change my luck. By the time December came, I had little more than the clothes on my back, a worn satchel, and June in my arms. The high country was no place for the unprepared, but every mile felt like another door closing behind me. So I kept on. Somewhere beyond that ridge, the snow was falling hard, and the light was dying fast. That was when I saw the cabin. Smoke curled from its chimney, and for the first time in days, I thought I might be looking at a place where the wind didn't reach. I stepped toward it, one foot breaking the crust of snow, then the other. And just as I reached the clearing, the door began to open. Sawyer's cabin stood small but sturdy against the white slope, its low roofline carrying the weight of the storm without a groan. He had a fire going strong in the hearth, and the heat hit me in waves the moment he shouldered the door shut behind us. My legs barely held as he set me down on a buffalo hide spread before the flames. The wool blanket pulled tight around June and me before I could think to speak. My dress clung cold to my skin, stiff in places where frost had bitten through. But my hands moved on their own, loosening the layers enough to see my daughter's face. Her cheeks were red from the wind, lips dry, eyes shut, but breathing steady. He crouched beside us without saying a word, his big hands moving sure as he unwrapped the frozen cloth from my shoulders. A kettle was already on the stove, and he poured hot water into a tin cup, the steam curling into the air. He held it out. My fingers shook so badly I thought I'd spill it, so he steadied the cup in my grip until I could take a sip. The water burned going down, but it reached places inside me the cold hadn't yet taken. "You got a name?" he asked at last, his voice low and rough from years in the wind. "Leona," I told him, and then after a pause, "Leona Gray." He nodded once, "Remember anything, Snow?" I said, my voice catching. I didn't mean to come this far, just kept walking. Sawyer didn't press. He rose, set another blanket on my legs, and crossed to a shelf where he fetched a small jar of goat's milk and a scrap of muslin. "Boil it first. Let it cool." You know how I nodded. I was a midwife once back in Missouri. He looked at me for a beat longer than before, but didn't ask more. While he stepped outside to chop more wood, I found the strength to move June closer to the fire. The milk simmered in the small pot, its faint scent mixing with the smell of pine smoke and damp wool. By the time he came back in Snow clinging to his beard, June's eyes had opened just enough to follow the sound of my voice. The hours passed slow. I stayed near the hearth, feeding her in tiny spoonfuls every swallow she managed, easing a knot inside me. Sawyer kept to himself, mending a lantern plate at the table, the scrape of his knife steady against the metal. The quiet was heavy but not unkind. "What day is it?" I asked after a while. "Tuesday, I think. You keep track. Enough to know when to trap and when to leave the stew alone." "Another hour," he said, and there was the faintest flicker of humor in his tone. I told him I didn't mean to be a burden. "You're not," he said simply, and went back to his work. It was a short answer, but something in the way he said it made me believe it. By the second day, my legs were strong enough to help with the dishes. The water in the basin was cold, and the soap barely lathered, but the work was familiar. My hands remembering movements I hadn't had the will for in weeks. Sawyer noticed, though. He didn't say so, just kept on fixing the cracked handle of a cast iron pan. He asked if I'd really delivered babies. I told him 3 years in Springfield, learning from a doctor's wife. "Deliver this one yourself?" he asked, nodding toward June asleep in her crate by the fire. "No choice," I said. She came early. I boiled Snow in an old coffee pot and prayed I wouldn't bleed out. "You did good," he said, quiet but certain. I didn't thank him, but my shoulders eased just a little. That night after June was down, I sat sewing a tear in my coat while Sawyer whittled a peg for the barn latch. My eyes lifted to him. "You said you had a wife once. What happened, Fever?" "Lost her and the boy in 2 days." "I'm sorry." He gave a slow nod. "Long time ago. Still feels like last year sometimes." The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like we both knew there was nothing to fix, only to carry. On the 5th day, the snow stopped falling, but the cold turned sharper, biting deep enough to make every chore deliberate. Sawyer took the axe to clear a path to the well. I dressed June in the warmest pieces we had, one of his old flannel shirts cut down and wrapped twice in blankets. She was holding her head up now, grunting softly, as if testing her strength. I stripped dried roots for broth at the table, glancing toward the window, when the door opened and he came back, in boots and beard heavy with frost. "Cleared the way to the well," he said. "Pump's frozen." "We've got enough for today," I told him. "A bucket and a half. Tomorrow's another problem. I can help. Snow's too deep. I can try." He studied me for a moment, then set his gloves on the hearth. "All right. Tomorrow." That evening, we ate at the table together for the first time. June slept in her crate tucked beneath 3 blankets, one of them small enough I knew it had been made for a child. Sawyer had given it without explanation, just laid it over her like it belonged there. "You don't eat much," I said as we dipped bread in the broth. "I'm used to it. Army rations'll do that to a man. How long were you in? 4 years? Saw every kind of battle? You came out in one piece." "No one did," he said, and we both let the quiet settle. "Do you ever go into town?" I asked. "Only when I have to. Last summer sold pelts, picked up salt and a new trap. What would they say if you brought a woman and child with you? They'd ask if you were my wife. And what would you say? I'd say you weren't. But I'd also say, you're under my roof, and that's all they need to know." It was the plainest kind of protection, but it reached me all the same. The wind outside rose again, rattling the window, and for the first time since I'd stepped into that cabin, I realized I didn't feel like someone passing through. The next day would bring its own work, the frozen pump, the snow that needed moving, and whatever came with it. But for now, the fire was steady. The air warm enough for June to sleep easy, and Sawyer's boots rested by the hearth where the ice was melting off. The storm had broken, but the winter was far from over. The cold settled in deep as the days stretched on, turning the cabin into a sanctuary of quiet routine and careful survival. Outside, the snow had crusted hard and brittle, cracking under Sawyer's boots as he moved steadily through the trees. Inside, the fire's glow painted long shadows on the log walls, while June slept beneath layers of wool, her breathing soft but sure. I found myself moving with purpose again, stripping dried roots for broth, and patching the worn seams of my coat hands steady, despite the ache that lingered in my joints. The rhythm of life here wasn't easy, but it was something real, and for the first time in weeks, that steadiness was enough. Sawyer and I fell into an unspoken partnership. He cleared the path to the well, his axe biting through frozen wood while his breath hung like smoke in the sharp air. The pump was frozen solid, and water was a ration meted out with quiet care. I helped where I could, learning how to reset snares and read tracks in the snow, my eyes often flicking toward the dark line of trees beyond the clearing. I knew I wasn't entirely safe. A shadow of fear clung tight, the memory of what I fled, never far. Yet the warmth of this cabin, the steady presence of a man who didn't ask for explanations or promises, began to chip away at that cold. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters, I found myself watching Sawyer as he worked the rifle's barrel with slow, practiced movements. His hands were steady, but the lines on his face told stories of battles fought long ago, losses carried in silence. He mentioned how he drifted after the war, building fences and cutting timber, searching for a place where the noise of towns and men's talk couldn't reach him. I shared a little of my own past, speaking softly about the man I'd left behind, the anger, the threats, the nights when I thought I might not live to see the dawn. He didn't pry, but his steady gaze was a quiet invitation to be honest in my own time. The cold outside never truly lifted. It settled into the bones of the land and the people who lived on it. We measured every task by survival, every chopped log, every boiled pot of broth, every careful step outside the cabin. But even in that hard winter, moments of fragile hope appeared. I noticed a loose board near the hearth and pointed it out. Sawyer crouched to patch the draft, with strips of canvas and nails working silently beside me. Our hands brushed once or twice, brief touches that carried more meaning than words. The cabin started to feel less like a shelter and more like a place where something new could take root. On a cold morning, we made a slow walk to the frozen creek. The air was sharp, biting deep in my lungs, but I wore Sawyer's patched coat tied tight at the waist, and the weight of his presence steadied me. We spoke then of what had been lost and what still might be found. He talked about his wife Eleanor and the spring days they once shared here, fishing at the creek's edge. I told him I hadn't let go yet, that the past clung stubbornly, even in this quiet place. He said someday I would, when something better lay ahead. For a long moment we stood side by side in the snow, the forest holding its breath with us. The fear I carried didn't vanish, not completely. But Sawyer's quiet protection began to wear down the walls I'd built. He promised no man would take me back, that I was safe while he breathed. That night, when the fire burned low and June stirred in her sleep, I reached out and brushed my hand against his sleeve. There was no rush, no grand confession, only the quiet understanding of two people who had run too far and long. The soft touch of his hand over mine was enough to chase away the loneliness I'd carried so long. Winter's grip was relentless, but the warmth inside that cabin grew stronger with each passing day. And though the world beyond the trees held dangers I could not yet face, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't known was possible: the courage to stay. As dusk settled one evening, the sound of horses' hooves echoed faintly over the ridge, carried by the wind. Sawyer paused by the window, eyes narrowing toward the darkening horizon. The moment was quiet but heavy, a reminder that the past was never far behind, and the trials yet to come were only just beginning. The hoofbeats faded into the wind before either of us spoke. Sawyer stayed at the window a moment longer, his hand resting on the sill, then turned back to the fire. "Could have been a trapper," he said, though his tone carried more caution than certainty. I nodded, but felt the familiar tightness return to my chest. It was the sound of the world outside reminding me that it hadn't gone anywhere. The next morning the sky was clear and sharp, the snow bright enough to sting the eyes. Sawyer brought in a bucket of water from the melt pot, setting it on the stove while I wrapped June snug in her blankets. She stirred little hands, pushing against the cloth, her strength growing by the day. I caught Sawyer watching her for a moment before he pulled on his coat. "We'll walk to the creek today," he said. "Path's still good, and the air will do you right." We stepped out together, our boots sinking into the hard crust. The forest stood still around us, every pine bough heavy with snow. My breath rose in small clouds, and I matched my pace to his steady stride. At the creek, now frozen into a pale ribbon, Sawyer stopped and rested his gloved hands on the haft of his axe. "Used to bring Eleanor here," he said. "Come spring, the water runs fast, good for fishing." I stood beside him, the cold finding every seam in my coat. "You talk about her plain," I said. "Not like you're still holding on." "I remember what was real," he replied. "Let go of what I thought could have been." I looked out over the ice. "I haven't let go yet." "You will," he said, "when what's ahead is better than what's behind." We walked back in silence, the only sound the snow breaking under our feet. Inside, I laid June in her crate, and Sawyer went to the woodpile, stacking the day's cut along the wall. When he came in, I asked, "Why'd you take me in?" He didn't look away from the fire as he answered, "Because you were dying, and because I was tired of watching people die." He hesitated. "And when I saw you holding that child, something in me said not to let you go." The air in the cabin felt different after that. We moved around each other with a kind of awareness, handing tools without being asked, passing close enough for a sleeve to brush. That night, I sat mending a pair of socks while Sawyer repaired the latch on the cupboard. When I looked up, he was watching me, not with question or demand, just a steady regard. I set the socks down and crossed the space between us, pressing my lips to his. It was slow, cautious, but real. He didn't pull away. After we sat close by the fire, the quiet wrapping around us. June slept soundly, her small breaths mixing with the crackle of the wood. I didn't feel the need to speak, and neither did he. It was enough to share the warmth and the stillness. Over the next days, the snow softened under the midday sun, refreezing at night into a slick crust. Sawyer showed me how to set a snare, his hands guiding mine as I tied the loop. "Always check the trail," he said. "You'll see where rabbits cut across." I listened, learning the small details that kept a table from going bare in a place like this. One morning I woke before him. The fire was low, and June was still asleep, curled against the worn coat he'd given her. I stepped onto the porch. The air was brittle and cold. The ridge lit pale by the rising sun. I scanned the trail leading down into the timber. No tracks, just the same unbroken crust. Still, I kept my hands tucked into fists inside my shawl. When Sawyer stirred and saw the door open, he waited until I came back inside. "Anything?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. "But I'd like to see the town." His brow lifted slightly. "You want to go? I want to send a letter. Not home, just to know I can." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "Wagon's still good. We'll ride down tomorrow." That afternoon, we set aside pelts to trade a bundle of dried herbs and a small shawl he'd found in a trunk and told me to take. The next morning, the ride down was cold but dry, the horse's breath hanging in the air. When the buildings came into view, a line of wood-front shops, the general store, the blacksmith's shed, my shoulders tensed. Sawyer noticed. "You can wait in the wagon," he offered. "I need to see it," I said. Inside the general store, the smell of coffee and tobacco hung in the air. Sawyer set the pelts on the counter. "Coffee, salt, sugar if it'll stretch. Cloth if you've got it." The storekeeper nodded and disappeared into the back. My eyes kept to the floorboards, but I noted every sound near the door. "You all right, Sawyer?" asked quietly. "I don't like rooms with one way out," I said. He set his hand lightly at my back, just enough to anchor me until we stepped outside again. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sky was turning gold at the edges. That evening, as I fed June by the fire, Sawyer sat beside me. "She looks like you," he said. I smoothed a curl from her forehead. "Sometimes I worry she'll remember the worst, the hunger, the nights I screamed." "She won't," he said. "You held her through it. That's what she'll know." I met his eyes, feeling the truth in the words. "You're not just shelter anymore," I said quietly. He didn't speak, just watched me until I added, "I want to be here when the thaw comes. I want her to grow up knowing the sound of your boots coming in from the woods." Sawyer's jaw worked once before he answered. "Then stay." The firelight flickered against the walls, and somewhere outside the wind began to shift, carrying with it the scent of change. The thaw was still weeks away when Sawyer came back from checking his traps with a look I hadn't seen before. He hung his coat by the door and met my eyes. "Boot tracks," he said. "Not mine, not yours. Just one pair heading along the ridge." I felt the heat drain from my face. "Could it be a trapper?" "Could be," he answered, but they weren't fresh enough to follow. No wagon, no sign. They stopped. I gathered June into my arms, her weight a comfort and a warning all at once. "If he found his way this far," Sawyer cut me off, his voice steady. "If someone comes here, they don't get past me." We kept to our routine, but the air inside the cabin felt different. Sawyer boarded the front windows that evening, not in panic, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done it before. I stayed near the fire, my eyes following him as he moved from one wall to the next. Each time he passed my hand, brushed his sleeve or coat hem, just enough to remind myself he was there. Later, when June was asleep and the fire had burned to embers, I asked, "Do you think they'll come?" He stared into the coals. "I don't know, but I've lived long enough to trust a bad feeling." The way he said it, low and sure, made me ease closer until my knee touched his. Without thinking, I reached for his hand. His fingers closed gently over mine. I leaned in and kissed him. Not hurried, not searching, just enough for him to know I meant it. When we parted, my forehead rested against his. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. "I just know I don't want to lose it." He didn't answer, only kept his hand over mine. We stayed that way until the fire died down and the chill edged in from the walls. That night, I didn't take the bed. I laid down beside him on the floor with June between us, 3 steady breaths, finding the same rhythm. The next days passed without sign of anyone on the ridge. The sun rose earlier, bringing pale light through the shutters. Sawyer began teaching me more about the traps, how to place them along a run, how to mask our scent. My hands were clumsy at first, but he never rushed me. One morning I rose before him. The fire was low, and June was still curled in her blankets. I stepped out onto the porch. The air bit through my shawl, but the trail was undisturbed, the snow crust still unbroken. When I came back in, Sawyer was standing waiting. "No tracks," I told him. He nodded. "We'll check again this afternoon. I hesitated, then said, "You ever think about going to town for a few things?" "You want to?" he asked. "I'd like to send a letter. Not home, just to prove I can." He studied me a moment, then nodded. "We'll take the wagon tomorrow." That afternoon, we set aside what we had to trade pelts, dried herbs, and a small hand-stitched shawl he found in a trunk. At dawn, the ride into town was cold but dry. June sat on my lap under layers of cloth, her head against my chest. Sawyer kept the pace steady until the buildings came into view, no more than a row of false fronts and the general store at the center. "You can wait in the wagon," he said. "I need to see it," I replied. Inside, the scent of coffee and lamp oil filled the air. Sawyer laid the pelts on the counter. "Coffee, salt, sugar, if it'll stretch, and some cloth." He told the storekeeper, who nodded and went to the back. I stood still, my eyes tracking every sound near the door. "You all right?" Sawyer asked quietly. "I don't like rooms with one way out." His hand rested at my back until we stepped outside again. By the time we returned, the sky was orange at the edges. That night, as June dozed in my arms by the fire, Sawyer sat beside me. "She's got your eyes," he said. I smoothed her hair. "Sometimes I worry she'll remember the worst. The nights I screamed the hunger, she won't," he said. "She'll remember you held her." I looked at him, the firelight catching the lines of his face. "You're not just shelter anymore," I said. He didn't look away. "Then stay." The wind outside had shifted, carrying with it a scent that wasn't entirely winter. But the way it rattled the boards reminded me the season and the dangers I'd left behind weren't finished with us yet. By the second week of March, the snow was thinning in patches near the south wall of the cabin. Meltwater dripped from the eaves, soaking the earth in narrow lines. But winter still held on in the shaded places. Sawyer was outside splitting wood when I heard the crunch of boots in the hard snow. Not his steady rhythm, but lighter, quicker. I stepped to the door with June balanced on my hip, my other hand braced on the frame. A man was making his way up the narrow path from the timberline, his coat open at the collar and a rifle slung easy over his shoulder. Sawyer turned his axe, lowering but not leaving his grip. The man raised a hand in greeting as he came closer. "Name's Eli Mercer," he said when he reached the yard. "Trapping west of here. Saw your smoke and thought you might trade." Sawyer glanced toward me, then back to him. "We've got pelts." "You've got salt," Mercer nodded. "And coffee." His eyes shifted briefly to June, then away. "Storm caught me low in the valley. Figured it'd be smart to rest where the roof's tight." Sawyer stepped forward. "You can share a meal. Then you move on." Mercer's smile was polite, but I felt something in it that made my grip on June tighten. Inside, I set her in her crate and ladled broth into a tin bowl, while Sawyer stacked the man's salt on the table. They spoke in low tones about trap lines and the fox pelts still running lean this late in the season. I kept to the stove, listening without letting on. When Mercer left an hour later, his boots crunching back toward the trees, Sawyer shut the door firmly. "Don't care for company lingering," he said. "Do you think he was alone?" I asked. "Hard to say. But I'll keep watch." That night, Sawyer set the rifle within easy reach of the table. We ate with the baby between us, her small hands curling around my finger while the fire popped. The quiet felt heavier than usual. 2 mornings later, I saw tracks again near the ridge, the same tread as before, coming closer this time, before turning off. Sawyer studied them, his jaw tight. If this is Mercer, he's circling. What would he want? He didn't answer right away. Sometimes a man's not after a thing. Sometimes he's just measuring how far he can press. We stayed closer to the cabin, after that, working together, to stack the last of the split wood under the overhang and check the snares no more than a quarter-mile out. Even June seemed to sense the change, fussing less, when I kept her strapped against me in the sling. One evening, as the light thinned, Sawyer pulled a strip of rawhide through his hands, making a new tie for the barn door. I sat at the table mending one of his shirts, the needle flashing in the lamplight. "You ever think about leaving here?" I asked. "Not anymore," he said. "I left once, came back because it's the only place that made sense. I've been running so long," I said quietly. "But I'm tired of looking over my shoulder." His eyes met mine across the table. "Then stop running. You're here now." We didn't speak of Mercer again, but his presence sat between us like the cold that seeps in at night no matter how strong the fire. When Sawyer went to town for supplies, I watched the ridge until his return, the sight of his coat through the trees loosening something in my chest. That night after June was asleep, I stood by the window looking out at the pale moonlight on the snow. Sawyer came to stand beside me close enough that I could feel the heat from his shoulder. "If Mercer comes back," I said, "we face him together." He gave a single nod. "We will." The wind outside eased to a whisper, carrying with it the scent of pine sap and wet earth, a reminder that seasons were turning. But the next one might bring its own kind of trouble. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke when Sawyer stepped in from the yard, his hat pulled low and his eyes scanning the tree line behind him. He set the rifle by the door and unbuttoned his coat without speaking. I knew before he told me Eli Mercer had been close again. Sawyer moved to the table, taking the coffee pot in hand, his voice low. "Found his tracks less than 100 yards from the barn. He's watching for the right moment." I set June's blanket straighter where she lay in her crib and felt the stillness stretch between us. Then we can't give him one. The rest of the day passed slow. I kept June in the sling, even while kneading bread, her warm weight against me as the smell of yeast filled the cabin. Sawyer checked the barn twice, his boots leaving dark prints across the thawing ground. Just before dusk, a rider came along the south trail. My breath caught until I saw the square shoulders and steady seat of Sheriff Amos Calder. He reined up at the gate, his gelding blowing steam into the cooling air. "Evening," he called. "Heard there's been a stranger nosing around." Inside, the sheriff's presence seemed to ease the room, though his voice stayed measured. "Name like Eli Mercer's been mentioned in town before. Traitor when it suits him, trouble when it doesn't." Sawyer nodded. "He's testing our line. I aim to stop that before it goes further." Calder rested his hat on his knee. "I'll ride the ridge come morning, see if he's set camp nearby. You keep your rifle close and your doors latched." After the sheriff left, the night felt heavier. The quiet settling deep, I rocked June until her eyes closed. Her small hand curled against my collar. Sawyer sat by the stove, oiling the rifle, his movements steady and sure. The following day brought clear skies, the snow melting fast into rivulets along the yard. I took the wash to the line, my eyes on the trees. That's when I saw movement, a shadow breaking where the sun struck the slope. Sawyer was beside me, in a breath, his gaze fixed. "Inside," he said. I obeyed, gathering June close, watching through the small window as Sawyer stepped out toward the barn, the rifle in his hands. Minutes dragged before he returned. "Just a deer," he said, though the set of his jaw told me Mercer was still out there, even if unseen. That night, while Sawyer secured the barn, I banked the fire and set a chair near the crib. I meant to sit only a while, but the soft crackle of the coals and June's even breathing kept me there, until I heard boots on the porch. Sawyer stepped in his coat, damp from the night air. "Tracks again," he said quietly. "Closer this time." We both knew the next move would come soon. The air inside felt warm from the fire, but the sense of something pressing in from the dark never left. I checked the latch twice before settling back at the table, the lamplight pooling across the worn boards. Sawyer sat across from me, his voice steady but low. "When it comes, we face it together." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint, unmistakable creak of saddle leather from somewhere beyond the yard. The sound of that saddle leather in the dark was the last warning we got. Sawyer eased the door open, rifle in hand, while I stayed near June's crib, my own breath slow and steady. The lantern light spilled onto the porch, catching the pale glint of Eli Mercer's eyes before he stepped forward. Sawyer's voice carried low but firm. "You've been skulking around my land for days. You got business, speak it." Mercer shifted his weight, one hand brushing the worn stock of the revolver at his hip. "I'm here for what's owed to me." Before Sawyer could answer, another set of boots sounded on the porch. Sheriff Calder stepped into the lamplight, his badge catching the glow. "That's far enough, Mercer. You've got a warrant in 2 counties, and I'll be seeing you answer for it." The stillness held for a long moment before Mercer's shoulders slumped. Calder's hand stayed steady on his own sidearm as he closed the space, disarmed him, and bound his wrists. The relief in my chest came slow, like thaw after a hard freeze. They led him away into the night, the sound of hooves fading down the trail. Sawyer came back inside, setting the rifle on its rack before taking June from her crib and holding her close. "It's over," he said quietly. "We can breathe now." The days that followed felt different. The air seemed lighter, the nights quieter. Sawyer mended a section of fence out near the north pasture, and I planted early peas in the kitchen garden. Calder stopped by once to say Mercer was bound for trial in a larger town down the river, and likely prison after that. One Sunday afternoon, we walked together to the small clapboard church in town. Folks nodded as we passed, some offering quiet words about standing our ground. I realized then that home wasn't just the cabin or the land. It was the steadiness of the people who stood with you when it mattered. Now, when the wind comes down from the ridge and rattles the eaves, I think back to those nights and the way fear can settle deep in a place. But I also remember how it can be cleared by courage, by justice, and by the choice to keep building a life worth defending. If this story has found a place in your heart, I hope you'll carry its lesson forward. Out here and maybe where you are, too, kindness and resolve can turn even the hardest season toward the light.